It's a rather unfortunate trend in popular history that people really seem to enjoy comparisons of things. Comparisons of different kinds of weapons, different generals and armies, different kinds of soldier, even different civilizations on the whole, even when these things really not only don't belong being compared, but really even cannot be academically honestly compared with one another. Now, oftentimes, yes, we see these sorts of comparisons in, let's just say, 2-bit television programs asking which kind of soldier is the most deadly and whatnot. But unfortunately, as well, these trends sometimes do leak into more well-regarded sources. I'm speaking particularly here about a certain video that was forwarded to me by someone from the Smithsonian's YouTube channel, which was seeking rather erroneously to compare the Dreyse Needle Rifle, an 1840s German invention, with an old flintlock musket. Just as a bit of background information, the Dreyse Needle Rifle was an early form of breech-loading firearm. That is in contrast to a muzzle-loading firearm where you're loading it down the top of the gun and then ramming a cartridge down the barrel. You're actually loading it from the back, the breech of the barrel. You would open up the gun using a bolt, sort of a simple bolt-action rifle in a way as well. You take a cartridge which actually had the percussion cap already pre-positioned inside of the cartridge. You put that entire unit into the back of the gun, and then when you close it, pulling the trigger would not have a hammer or a cock fly forward and then strike against a percussion cap outside of the piece. Rather, pulling the trigger would release a needle, or a firing pin, as we'd call them today, which would shoot through the cartridge, strike the percussion cap, and then, ignite the powder and release the actual, release the round. Now, naturally, that development led to a number of advantages for the firearm, primarily being that you don't have to take extra time to, insert a separate percussion cap onto the piece and then ram down a cartridge. Rather, it's all in one go, open, in, shut, good to go. It's because of this that, at least on the parade standards, it was, at least I read rapidly online, that the Dreyse Needle Rifle could achieve around 6 rounds every minute when compared to a more traditional muzzle-loading firearm, which could expect between 3 and 4 on the parade grounds, again, depending on how well trained the soldiers are, ideal standards and ideal conditions, things like that. That being said, of course, there were drawbacks to the system as well, or at the very least, I should say, I'm not an expert on the piece, obviously, but I can say at the very least there were perceived drawbacks to the system. Otherwise, as you may imagine, it would have taken over the world. Every single army would have been using them, and it would have been needle guns throughout all the world, as opposed to in just some Germanic nations, and probably some others around the world as well. But for the most part, the other major powers, the British and the French, and even the Americans, were not adopting this thing right off the bat. Rather, they stuck with the old muzzle-loading firearms, primarily because they were perceived to be more reliable. It was thought that that thin little needle is a very finicky thing, and something could go wrong with the process, something goes wrong with the mechanism, and the gun could break, and it becomes unusable. It was also perceived to be a little bit more complicated for the average soldier to be able to work and maintain appropriately, which, while that might work for, say, a Prussian army, which is primarily only operating in Europe, well, the French and the British, they have colonial empires around the world. They need much more rugged firearms, which are fit for foreign service. That being said, however, the title of the Smithsonian video is not quite so nuanced. It is titled, and I quote, "Why a Dreyse Needle Gun Beats a Musket Rifle in Every Way." In every way. Not just that it's faster, not just that it's, more efficient or accurate or anything. It beats it in every way. Must mean that it was cheaper, easier to manufacture, easier to clean, all these other things. Every way. That's quite a dramatic turn of phrase, isn't it? But, and I would forgive it if they asked the question, is the Dreyse Needle Gun better than it? But they didn't do that. You see, that's the good clickbait way. That's how I do things with my videos, for example. Is Benjamin Martin the worst written character ever? I never say that he's the worst written character ever. I am simply posing the question. But these ones, oh, they're very absolute. They're saying the Dreyse Needle Gun is, in fact, better than anything else on the market. Well, again, why it didn't take over the world then, who knows? But anyways, we'll move on. Right off the bat, you may look at that title as well and say, hold on now, musket rifle, aha, there's a Farbery right there for you. There's no such thing as a musket rifle, it's either one or the other. And, well, kind of, sort of, not entirely. You see, the term isn't entirely appropriate. I think a more appropriate term would be a rifled musket, because that's the term that's usually used, and there actually is such a thing as a rifled musket. Basically a muzzle-loading musket, the same in every other way, except inside the barrel it is, in fact, rifled. Now you may be asking yourself, well, hold on, wouldn't that just make it a rifle? What's the difference between a rifle and a rifled musket versus a smoothbore musket? All these. Again, I'm afraid I'm not an expert on firearms history and firearms technicalities, so I can't really go into that, but suffice to say, the term rifled musket is in fact appropriate to the 19th century, and think of things like the P-53 Enfield. That is a rifled musket. It's being loaded, with a percussion cap, cartridge down the muzzle, ramming it home in a traditional, muzzle-loading musket style. I think that's probably why they're phrasing it as a musket, because it's the same as, the old flintlock things of old in terms of the basic loading process, but it is still a rifled piece, ergo rifled musket. However, it is worthy of note that while the title of the video is referring to a rifled musket, or musket rifles, in fact, the video itself does not feature one. Rather, they have the Dreyse Needle Gun being compared against, or being put up against, an old flintlock musket, and particularly a second pattern, a short land pattern, brown Bess musket, the kind of firearm that the British Army was using in the American War of Independence back in the 1770s. What they're doing here is comparing a firearm which was first introduced in the 1840s and saw its main use in the 1860s. They're comparing it with a firearm many, many years earlier from the 1760s, 70s, and 80s. So right off the bat, we have a pretty big problem with this entire experiment, in that they're not actually comparing like with like, because for the majority of the Dreyse needle rifles, needle gun, whatever you want to call it, its history, it's not being put up against flintlock musketry. It's being put up against percussion cap musketry. Again, things like the P-53 Enfield and whatnot, where you are not having to, open up a pan and pour out a small amount of gunpowder into the gun before closing it up and then pouring the rest of the powder down. Rather, it's one where you simply take a percussion cap and put it over top of something called a nipple on the firearm, which the hammer then strikes that, the explosion goes down a vent into the gun, and then it's able to have it go off. Again, I'm sure you all know that process. I don't have to go into very long lengths to explain it. But one of the big things that they talk about in the video as far as the advantages of the Dreyse needle gun is that its mechanism is not exposed to weather.
Back then, the weapon's ignition was not weatherproof because the flintlocks were exposed to the elements.
Whereas they say with an older, as they show flintlock, the entire mechanism is exposed to the conditions, and ergo it's a massive advantage because your powder won't get wet and whatnot with the Dreyse. But that's not appropriate for what you ought to be comparing the Dreyse needle gun to, which is a percussion cap, which is a much more, shall we say, weather-safe device. So not only do we have a rather strange discrepancy here between the title of the video and the content of the video, which that's a rather simple thing that they should be able to change pretty quickly, but the actual experiment itself is not terribly useful because they're comparing a much more highly developed, shall we say, firearm with a more primitive one, just objectively speaking. They go on at this point to refer to the needle rifle as a wonder weapon, ein Wunderwaffe, which again seems a little overly sensationalist to me. It seems like they're trying to appeal to this whole idea of, the German super weapon and all that, which is obviously a very popular sentiment in, well, most American and otherwise popular history.
Weapons expert Wolfgang Stabe wants to test this wonder weapon from 1866.
Ein Wunderwaffe, the kind of weapon which will change not only an individual war, but the course of human history. Things like night vision could maybe be considered ein Wunderwaffe. Rockets technology and jet planes, helicopters and massive tanks the size of a continent. Or, as in this situation, the term is being applied to a modular, a moderate increase in the efficiency of a firearm type, using, again, technology which already existed. I mean, yes, sure, there are so-called, World War II German Wunderwaffe, which were basically just like, oh, it's a tank, but it's a little bigger. Like, okay, so I guess, you can use the term wonder weapon in that sort of context, but it does strike me as a little sensationalist. Ultimately, this is not a very wonderful weapon. It is a slight increase, potentially, over existing models. And again, looking at the actual record of the needle rifle, a lot of nations did not adopt it for, again, I think very practical concerns. Concerns of economy, concerns of maintenance and application in an actual military setting. So actually, maybe in that way, the term Wunderwaffe is really quite applicable in that it actually didn't really change all that much. But again, I don't really know the history of the rifle itself. Maybe it was a very influential piece, but overall, still, the term Wunderwaffe seems a little much, I think. And then, of course, we come to the meat of the video, the actual experiment. Or at least what they call an experiment. I'm afraid that the scientific method is not exactly being very well applied here. First things first, actually, how they're testing these firearms is they're setting up a number of targets and they're having two men shoot at them. Two separate individuals firing the different guns. Do you see how that's not very scientific? We have so many variables at play here which are outside of the guns themselves. Supposedly we're only testing the guns and their individual merits, and yet now when we have different marksmen, we are introducing matters of, well, which one of them is a better shot? Which one of them is better at loading the guns? Which one of them is more steady in their hand? Even something so specific as, what if something happens to one man during the test that doesn't happen to another? He sees a butterfly going by and he is temporarily, moderately for a millisecond distracted by that before he's able to take his shot. Obviously a very silly example, but you see what I mean here. There are so many variables which are introduced in this situation that are outside of the pieces of equipment themselves. Rather, with a properly scientific test, you need to make sure that you are reducing the number of variables as much as you possibly can. Who's to say that one of those men is not really, really good, has reached the absolute height in firing his particular firearm, whereas the other one is just kind of a casual shooter? Who's to say even that if these two men are indeed experts in their field, that they are equal experts? Maybe one is the Olympian, one is just the professional, if you know what I mean. Again, when you have multiple individuals, the variables get out of control rather quickly. And what's more, of course, is that they're only doing the test once. Each of these men are shooting for a minute and then they're calling it a day. And, at the end of that little shown off experiment, the narrator just comes in and says, oh, well, as you can see, clearly the needle rifle wins out in this situation. Well, clearly, no, you haven't shown us anything. Okay, sure. For entertainment purposes, show us one test of two guys shooting the guns. But then if you want to actually prove to me beyond a doubt that the needle rifle is superior than the flintlock, which should be obvious anyways because it's older technology, then how about you do a couple more tests? Do like 5, 10, 20, 100 tests maybe if you want to try and narrow down those potential variables as much as possible. Not only have many tests, but have it done with many different individuals, different marksmen. Sometimes you have one man shooting both. Sometimes you have it with two. Sometimes you have entire lines of soldiers, whatever. Change things up and try and make it to where you get enough data to where you can actually chart a genuine trend in that data as opposed to just one little point and being like, well, clearly that's it. That's just the objective reality.
Compared to the Dreyse and its all-in-one cartridge, loading the muzzle is time-consuming. Wolfgang Stabe has managed 3 shots in 60 seconds. One of them hit the target. His opponent manages to load and fire his gun only once.
I mean, clearly the people at the Smithsonian are aware that that's how you do scientific testing. It's not just a matter of one point of data and that's it, but rather the generation of a lot of information and then the filtering through of that information. But I would like to see them actually show that to the audience. Show me a chart, show me graphs, show me the information that actually proves your point. Assuming, that is, that you actually did those tests. Something tells me that they didn't. They just went with, oh yeah, well that matches what we think is going to be the case, so yeah, we'll just put that up there. It's dishonest. It's not scientific. It is a one-off. is what it is. And that is, of course, to say nothing about the fact that these two individuals are hardly representative of the kinds of soldiers who would actually be using these firearms traditionally. Actually, a proper test, rather than having it be a practical test alone, alongside those practical tests, I would want to see period-appropriate tests. Find me the records of soldiers in history testing these things. Find me the battlefield records of how they performed. Find me the commentaries by military, commentators back in the day and whatnot. Because, there's an awful lot of that kind of stuff, particularly in the Victorian era. You can find all that information rather readily, I should think. And that is going to have a much greater, I think, influence over the actual final answer of which of these firearms is better. Those genuine historical accounts become so much more relevant, in particular, when you look at the men who were actually performing these tests in the video. First off, just one simple aside for the man firing the needle rifle, because I'm less familiar with it, he's firing it left-handed. Not a big concern, obviously, but for the majority of soldiers, historically speaking, they are not firing the weapon left-handed. Pretty much all military drill through pretty much all of history, to my knowledge, is entirely focused around the right hand. There are no lefties in the army, as it were. All of the drill, particularly for flintlocks, because, if you're aiming a flintlock, you want the lock on this side of your face, not on this side of your face. It's all based around on the right hand. And you can see that after the man takes his shot left-handed, he reaches down, and his working the bolt is more awkward than it otherwise would have been. The bolt action is geared around a soldier being right-handed, so he can take his shot, lower, open, then immediately after, he comes to this point, he can reach into a pouch or a bag of some sort, pull out the next cartridge, insert, close, and is good to go. By having this man, the simple fact of this man who's performing the test be left-handed, we are changing a variable from the historical commonality. Again, there were left-handed soldiers, but regularly speaking, that's not how the gun would be fired. Ergo, we are not testing it to its true condition. Now that, again, is a very small concern overall. It's a bit of a throwaway thing. Not a big deal if the rest of the test was still a good one. However, then we come to the gentleman who was firing the brown Bess. Now, nothing against him personally. I'm sure that he's a great shot. I'm sure that he's a very fine gentleman and everything. But I do not believe that he is an appropriate individual to be using for this particular test. Just look at the way that he's loading and firing this gun.
All in one cartridge. Loading the muzzle is time-consuming. The needle gun clearly has the edge in terms of speed.
Well, first off, he's not even loading from cartridge. In a military setting, again, how these firearms would actually be employed and the sort of thing that you should be testing, be it a percussion cap or a flintlock, should be a percussion cap, but we're using flintlock for whatever ungodly reason, you load from military cartridge, being a cartridge of paper with the black powder on the bottom and the actual shot, the bullet itself, on the top. You reach out the cartridge, you bite off the top, pour a small amount of powder, close. The rest of the powder immediately goes down the muzzle. The bullet then is already on the top. The actual ball is already ready to go. You just, push it down a little bit and then ram it home and you're good to go. Whereas what we see this gentleman doing is he is carefully measuring out the amount of powder he's pouring down rather than it being pre-measured in a cartridge. Then he's setting that down on the table. He reaches down, incidentally, the musket is on the ground this entire time. He reaches down, puts the musket ball over top, sort of make sure it's seated well, and then he starts ramming the thing down. Again, with cartridge, that's all already done for you. And then look at how he's ramming as well. He's really taking his time with that ramming. Whereas, again, historically, it should be ramrod out in two stretches, one and then two down, boom, boom. Maybe if you really want to make sure it's down there well, out, back into the piece itself, and then you're good to go. and again, the entire musket being on the ground, at least in Revolutionary War drill, changes in later times. In Napoleonic drill, you actually do have it on the ground. But Rev War drill, you actually have the gun aloft the entire time. It's not on the ground. It's actually held up. That way you can actually be reloading on the march, even on the run, on the go, as it were. Very, very fast-paced. And actually, along a similar line that the man is, not holding the musket properly while he's loading to be more conducive to speed, is that really all of his footwork, all of his drill is not to the military standard. Rather, his footing is a bit awkward, it's sort of out of place, whereas if he was going through this loading with cartridge and with the proper footwork, with the proper positioning of his hands and everything, well, he would find that the entire process is much, much faster. The drill was there for a reason. The highly formalized, highly standardized, and highly repetitious, positioning of the hands and the feet and everything while you're going through these processes, it was all there for a reason. It was there to make the soldier load and fire as fast, as quickly, and as automatically as possible. It was there for a practical reason, not just to look pretty. And if both of these men were actually loading and firing in a full and proper military style, well, then we would have information that is much more appropriate for this comparison, because ultimately this is a military comparison. They're talking about which firearm is better for military purposes. They're not just talking about, for private casual shooting experience. And I think that idea is rather heavily reinforced in that both of these men in the test are only achieving about half of the numbers that they should be able to. I read online, at least, again, I'm not an expert in this thing, so the numbers could very well be very different, but I at least saw, a quick Wikipedia search or whatever, that the Dreyse could fire up to 6 rounds every minute. This man is only firing 3, which is a rather dramatic difference. Now, something that I am much more familiar with, something that I do have the proper knowledge about from experience, the Brown Bess musket. He manages to pull off 1 shot in an entire minute? The military standard was, well, first off, at least 2 rounds on average in an actual battle, but the parade standard, when they're training, when they're drilling, when they're practicing, you could usually pull off between 3 and even potentially 4 rounds in a single minute. 3 rounds is kind of like the minimum standard for a trained soldier during that time period. It would only go down to 2, again, in like a battle scenario when all sorts of variables are, again, very, very different for the actual shooting. And then what's even better is the fact that he misses. In fact, the majority of all the shots fired in this little experiment are misses. Only one of them actually hits its mark. Now again, I cannot comment on the needle rifle, but as far as a Brown Bess musket is concerned, you should be able to hit your target between, 75 and 130 yards or thereabouts. In fact, skirmishing range, you could start shooting at your target up to 300 yards away. You're probably not going to hit anything, but that's sort of the rough range that a battle might actually start to commence in that, rough time period of the long 18th century. And I should imagine that the needle rifle is able to hit a man-sized target at a much further distance than the smooth-bore musket would be, again, because the needle rifle is a rifle. It is rifled inside the barrel. Unfortunately, actually, in the test, they don't even actually tell us the distance at which this shooting was taking place. They just tell us, oh, for this experiment, we set up a number of targets at the range and had these 2 random guys shoot at it.
For our experiment, tins and plastic bottles filled with liquid serve as targets.
Fire at will.
And there's another interesting point. Why these tiny targets? Why these, jars and jugs full of liquid randomly? Why is that useful for military purposes? It doesn't matter. If you're in a military setting, I don't think it much matters when you're firing in ranks against enemy platoons and companies and brigades and whatnot. I don't think it much matters if you're able to hit a teeny tiny point on the person as a target. I'm pretty sure it only matters if you manage to hit the person. They should be firing not at these little, targets. They should probably be firing at man-sized targets, and any hit counts as, well, exactly that, a hit. To which, again, probably all of those shots probably should have hit their mark. Marksmanship is very important during this time period. It's not like the soldiers aren't aiming. They are very much aiming down the line to hit the enemy, but it's not like they have to aim so specifically at, that one little point on an enemy's chest and make sure that they actually hit it, otherwise it doesn't count. No, you aim at that one little point on their chest, and so long as you hit really anywhere in that area, as far as the military is concerned, close enough is is enough, basically. Whether you hit the man in one artery or another artery, if you hit an artery, it does the same thing in the end. It doesn't really matter how you got there. There are just so many factors with this video, this bad pseudo-experiment, that make it ultimately, I'm afraid, rather useless for anything close to academic purposes. Even, I dare say, for entertainment purposes, because most people with an awareness of the scientific method will realize, well, hold on now, there are a few problems with how they're doing all of this. They're just performing one test and then saying, oh, well, clearly one is better than the other. Again, maybe if they were comparing like with like, it wouldn't be quite so easy a comparison to make, and especially if they were dealing with professional soldiers. And again, they're stepping out here, and based off of this limited, very flawed experiment, they're saying that this was the gun that beat out all of its competitors. It was the best, the singular best, which is just... I won't say that it's necessarily not the case, because again, I'm not an expert in these regards, but it's definitely not something that you can prove with this video or any of the information contained therein. That being said, of course, as flawed as the video is, there are still much, much, much worse shall we say, competitors out there for it. I'm looking at you, deadliest warriors. The sort of programs which will compare a knight versus a pirate. Which one would win in open field combat? Why a 17th century pirate, which is a ship-bound thief who is actively trying to avoid fights because that lowers your profit margin, against a heavy cavalry whose entire purpose was fighting for the king in large open field why they're being compared, who knows? But anyways, it's cool, right? Yeah, it's cool, I guess. A Spartan versus a ninja! Again, why we're taking something that is not even a battlefield unit to begin with, at least to my knowledge, and comparing it with a heavy, frontline hoplite infantry. It doesn't matter. It's neat, right? It's testosterone-fueled rage. Oh, look, they're beating each other up. That's cool, I guess. And then, of course, even worse, these dramatically inappropriate comparisons. USS Constitution versus HMS Victory is nothing in comparison to some of those comparisons that they make. The tests that they end up doing on those kinds of videos are even infinitely more worse than the one that we saw today with the Smithsonian. They'll have things like, which one is better, the longsword or the katana? And they'll have, like, the katana cut a pig in half, and then they'll have the longsword, like, stab into a piece of ice. And be like, well, clearly, given these two entirely different tests, we're gonna have to give the advantage to the katana because that's what'll go better in the ratings. Like, this is ridiculous. It's just utterly ridiculous. I remember when I was in middle school, I think, when those shows were coming out. I watching the first couple of episodes, to little middle schooler Brandon, oh boy, this is so cool, different soldiers fighting each other. Yeah, war is fun. And then realizing, but wait a second though, how can they actually draw conclusions when the tests are entirely different? And wait, why are these guys even? It's silly. It's utterly ridiculous. And ultimately, I dare say, it does nothing but commodify history. It makes it out to be a competition, sort of who would win, who was better. And the entire idea of that who was better narrative is not a very healthy one, I don't think. It's not very conducive to good history. The thing is, these comparisons can be made. You can genuinely inquire, okay, well, let's look at the Dreyse Needle Gun and compare it to similar firearms of its time. Was it genuinely an improvement, a development? Should other nations have adopted it? Or were the period arguments of why they didn't adopt it more authentic and, it was not as good as, some people make it out to be these days? Those tests can absolutely be valid, but the thing is, they need to be done, again, in a scientific way, and they need to be contained to very specific, shall we say, characteristics, very specific variables which are being tested. You cannot, for example, look at a question like, oh, which one of these guns was able to shoot better, and ergo, which one was just better overall? Well, no, there are a lot more factors in all of that. To say which gun was better, you need to not only look at battlefield performance, you need to look at ease of maintenance off of the battlefield. You need to look at cost of production. You need to look at all of these different social, political, economic, and military factors, which all feed into the overall, historiography history of a war. It's a very, very complicated subject, and just testing which one shoots better is hardly a scientific approach to an actual academic question. Anyways, I've been rambling on for infinitely too long, as usual, so thank you all so very much for watching. If anyone would be interested maybe in a little ranting video about Deadliest Warrior, then just let me know. I think we can maybe pull up one of those episodes and do something a bit more in-depth on it, so to say. But until that point in time, thank you all so very much for watching. Of course, in particular, to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com, for, of course, it is by virtue of your financial support that I am actually able to make videos like this one. And then, of course, to you as well, my dear viewer, for spending all this time with me today. Thank you very much for being here. Of course, until the next time, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.